Welcome back to the Redacted Culture Cast, where we bring an intellectual edge to gun culture and go oftentimes well beyond the firearm itself. And today we are addressing one of those conversations, debates, either ors that tend to not only bring a sense of discomfort when they're presented, particularly how they are argued, but also we're going to address that issue and start to answer it. The argument of whether a person should carry a firearm concealed or open being exposed on the hip, like a more of a duty holster or maybe even in your leather variety, versus something concealed, is an argument that very oftentimes leaves us with a sense of distaste. There's just no satisfying way to answer it quickly, and the answer itself, as presented, might also be a little bit equally less cathartic than what we might want. What I want to do here is I want to look at why and how these arguments are oftentimes framed and how we can do them better. And so, if you're considering carrying a firearm opened or concealed, stay tuned. But first, let's go to the sponsor. Obsidian Arms is one of those companies. They make a series of tools, armor's tools that come with a lifetime warranty. And if you've ever put together a more modern firearm using something like an AR-15 as an example, good news for you, they have a kit specifically designed for your needs. And so whether you are a professional or you are an amateur in the gunsmithing-ish world today, I'd suggest giving them a look. Not only does having a lifetime warranty on their tools take quite a bit of the edge off of what you're doing. If you've been working on firearms for a while, you'll come to realize that certain tools tend to see a lot more use than others. And instead of having to replace the whole kit, they are bringing an honest approach to their tool kits themselves. If you need to replace one tool, they will replace one. You don't have to go out and buy a whole new kit. So check them out at obsidianarms.com. Now, open carry versus concealed. This is the question, and it is a bit of a clickbait title, and it is one of those types of debates that is oftentimes found on the internet and also found in more of the depths of the forums and its places, but it also happens in public, in our families, in our communities, amongst one another, in our friends, in our basements, and so on and so forth. And the issue with open versus concealed carry can easily be described as a false dichotomy. You have an either or. You have to either choose to carry open or choose to carry concealed. At least that's how it very oftentimes is framed. And it's framed this way because we say things like, which is better? And oftentimes outside of, say, the rhetoric or logic of our arguments, we rely a bit on stereotypes to answer that, even if the answer tends to be the one that is the right answer. So if the word stereotype bothers you, you can use cliche, illustration, instance, paradigm, representation, type, or archetype. There are trends, abstractions, patterns, bromides, whatever it is. But the thing that I want to address in the room is the issue of how we argue over open carry versus concealed and what comes from that understanding, especially when we look at topics that are much more grave and culture reflecting. The issue, open carry arguments, and most oftentimes when you encounter arguments for open carry, you're dealing with what would be a rights-based argument. Someone might say, well, it's my right, so why should I do otherwise? And there's a sense of maybe indignation or frustration here where a person is appealing, they are refusing to appeal to somebody who does not share their values. You think about it this way. I have a right to bear arms, and that is codified in our Constitution. And even beyond that, I believe we have a moral obligation to be capable and protectors and defenders and so forth. So I am right. People who are uncomfortable are wrong. Shouldn't I carry open in the world? Now, this argument does actually have a little bit of not glue to it. It sticks in a certain way because if we're not careful, we might find ourselves being forced to justify our worldview in the framework of somebody who does not hold our values to be true. You think about it this way: somebody wants to they want to be careful about how they present themselves to the world in a certain sense, because they don't want to catch the ire of the left or whatever. Let's jump right into politics. And one of you, if you're listening and you know who you are, you reached out and we had a bit of a short back and forth over this recently. Thank you for doing that. But so what you get in this case is, well, let's think about the right to bear arms at all. Entirely. If I believe that I have a moral obligation to be able to possess firearms, and somebody believes that I do not have that moral obligation, or they believe that the possession itself would be considered evil or negative, then why would I try to win over their appeal? Why would I try to appeal to the values of people who don't hold my values? I'm sorry, why would I want to appeal to the tastes of people who do not hold my values? And if you want to even take this into a bit of a caricatured sense, why would a lion concern himself with the morality of sheep? But the problem is that you are not a lion, and you are not a wolf, and you are not a sheepdog, and you are not a sheep. You are a man. You are a human being. And the metaphor of the sheepdog, wolf thing sort of breaks down pretty quickly in reality, as there are not ontological categories by which we divide people. But I'm going back into the issue with, I need to go back and return to the address of open carry, because most often, again, what you see when you see an argument for open carry is you're seeing an argument for a right. It's a rights-based argument. The issue with that is the alternative, what is presented against it. And when arguments are presented for concealed carry, they are more oftentimes presented, or they are very oftentimes couched in a framework of utility. You might say, yes, you have the right to bear arms. However, the utility of a concealed firearm the utility that concealing a firearm provides, whether it's social presentation, blending in, gray man, whatever, or not telegraphing your capabilities to would-be predators, a concealed carry argument is typical, or in this case, is a utility argument. It is arguing that the utility of concealing a firearm supersedes or surpasses the utility of open carry. One might think of it a little bit like sliding scale balances, where on the one hand, the more open you get, the easier it is to draw the firearm, the faster you're going to be, whereas the more concealed your firearm is, the more difficult it will be for others to figure out that you even have one to begin with. And the reason why these two arguments, the open versus concealed arguments, do present themselves as not a true dichotomy but a false dichotomy, is that they are both appealing to different standards when it comes to truth-making principles. Or, in other words, they're arguing on different planes, not a higher or lower, but a different plane. The rights-based argument of an open carry advocate does not compute against the utility-based argument of a concealed carry argument, or a concealed argument, because they're using a different rubric to evaluate information. Openness, the one side is concerned with rights, and the other is concerned with utility. And that is what breaks the dichotomy. It is not really an either or, it is a both and. Because there are scenarios that you might want to conceal a firearm. There are scenarios why you might want to carry open, and there's sort of a third, not necessarily tier, but there's a third angle of approach here, which recognizes that if you believe in the right, and that the right supersedes any infringements, or it surpasses any infringements, then perhaps sometimes it is best to carry concealed, and there are other times when it would be better to carry open. And in the Walmart parking, or in the Walmart, I don't know, in Walmart is probably not the best place to be carrying open. Or if you're at a Best Buy, and this is we're gonna go back into those stereotypes. Now, the indignation that can be presented in an argument for a rights-based argument needs to be separated from what the argument truly is. And that this is so we can avoid relying too much on an ad hominem, even though, like I brought up earlier, stereotypes exist for a reason. And so if you are in a position, and you are in a position where you are carrying open all the time, and as a result you are constantly having to deal with socially frustrating situations, this might be something that we call a self-correcting error. If there is any amount of genuine reflection on what's going on, is that the issue is that though you are exerting your right, you are creating so many more challenges for yourself just to go about your day. That is different, however, than arguing that another authority, maybe even an unelected authority, has some sort of has the authority, or has the, let's call it right in this sense, to determine when it is socially and non-socially acceptable. In other words, how does this person get to determine norms? And so when I said earlier that the answer to the question isn't as cathartically releasing as we'd want it to be, the answer for open versus concealed carry is a both and. You should be able to do both, and you can see this represented in multiple different ways. Learning how to carry a firearm in or concealed, so you have your inside the waistband holster, or you have your off-body carry, your whatever your mechanism or your method is. If you can do that without also negating the ability to carry open. And this is where you've seen gear change over the last 15 years pretty drastically to scalability. You might be able to carry concealed and then upgrade or sort of level up or move up the urgency chart to adding a belt, like an overt shooting belt, and then go a little bit higher and add a plate or a rifle or change things like that. And the bigger you go, the louder you get, the more overt you are in that situation. You must be able to match that in an appropriate nature to the situation at hand. Imagine like you're going to what's something that's less generic than a government meeting. Imagine you're going to a wedding. Maybe that's a good example. Imagine maybe you're going to a wedding. No, you'd have to do it a little bit more. But imagine you're going to, yeah, we'll use a wedding as a reference. Imagine you're going to a wedding, and there's a certain social, let's call it, norm that a woman should not wear a white dress to a wedding because she is not the bride. Now, that norm, it can be that metaphor, that norm, that it also applies in other areas. If everywhere you go, you are wearing a plate carrier and an overt belt, and you are not functioning in the capacity of a police officer at that time, then imagine how much social fraying and imagine how difficult it would be to go about your day where every interaction is presented in this discomfort. And it's because wearing a plate carrier to the grocery store is not like normal. Now there might be jokes and nods in the parking lots and all this other goofy stuff, but it's not really. I'm not really making that argument. The argument that's more important is, or the argument that we're coming back to here is, if you have the ability to scale up and down, is perhaps more important than immediately answering the question in a broad sense of whether you should carry open or concealed. If if you're in a debate on this subject, be first sure to make sure that you are arguing on the same plane. And the same plane means you're both seeking after the same truth-making principle. The answer, or you're both working by the same standards in this sense. So if this is a rights-based argument and you are engaging on the level of rights, then you can have a conversation whether or not a person should carry open or should carry concealed on the basis of rights. And then you can move over a layer or off to a different plane and talk about the utility of one versus the other, which is where we typically get to our answers. You might have the right to carry a firearm everywhere you go. And let's use the metaphor of a post office as an example. It is, so far as I understand, despite challenges being presented in the courts, it is federally against the law to carry a firearm into a post office. And so let's say you're carrying concealed. Now, a purely legal argument would be to say, no, do not carry a firearm into a post office. However, something that is a little bit more utility might ask the question of, okay, but the process of taking my pistol, put it in, and locking it in my car is not only more burdensome, but also sets not only myself in a it's not a what's the word? It's not contrasting. It's compromised state, because you're sitting in your car putting a handgun away, and that is exactly the moment. It's right. We're about to hit a transition time. We're transitioning space where if someone were gathering a pattern of life on a person, that is a key time to see what they're doing. If you're to sit outside of a post office, and a post office is a great place to build a pattern of life on people. Recently we've seen there's been like sort of those political activists that are getting ready for the election, and imagine posing as a political activist asking for signatures about, it doesn't really matter what, it doesn't even need to be legit, but you get to stand outside a building, something like the post office, where people typically go for either personal or official work or official purposes in their own official. I mean, they might run a business out of a post office, or they might do something like that. The pattern of life gathering from that place is fantastic, just to be clear. And I'm using that reference point for no reason whatsoever. But now one might say that the utility of having to take my pistol off my belt and put it in a lockbox or lock it in my car and then go into the post office and then come back out and put it back in puts everybody in greater jeopardy, because that moment because it makes it really easy to identify who in the parking lot is carrying a firearm. And if somebody had the intent of breaking into a vehicle to get a firearm, that's a really great place to do it. I'm not advocating for crime. I'm just saying there's a certain vulnerability there. And then, so someone might say then in this case that, well, the utility of taking the known risk of concealing into a building and not making no one knows for the better or for the worse, just to get something there where you're only going to be there for a minute or two, the utility of taking that risk is superior to the risk gained by taking my firearm off, putting in a lockbox, putting that lockbox under my seat, and making myself in some sense a bit of a target. And now we're actually arguing on the same level. We started with something like legalities, and then we dealt with things like rights, and then we're moving on to, we dealt with then utility, and then we move on to something like rights. And so the dichotomy that we're talking about, the sort of either or between open or concealed, can be effectively dismissed, not simply by saying both and, but recognizing that it's not actually the argument that we're having. We're actually talking about maybe a scenario or a situation or some concern like that, and that comes with its own traps of the never-ending series of what-if questions. So we'll move on from there really quick. But this dichotomy, though false, also helps illustrate a larger social issue in the United States, and that is that people who are in support of gun control very oftentimes start their arguments from an argument of utility, whereas those who are in support or lean towards the Second Amendment or are on the side of the Second Amendment are arguing more often from a rights-based perspective, that it is the rights of the individual to bear arms has nothing to do with whether or not the government's actions and restrictions are effective at all in the first place. The argument from utility, even caricaturized in if it saves just one life, is still an argument from utility. That argument relies on a different foundation than the foundation by which somebody comes to ascertain that an individual, by being created in the image of God, has the right to bear arms. And this is how gun control and gun and Second Amendment arguments very oftentimes fail to meet meaningfully in the middle. Not in the middle as in like compromise, but rather meet because they're not even speaking on the same plane. If I go and argue that you have the right to bear arms and somebody else argues that your right to bear arms does not supersede my right to not feel unsafe, we are still now talking on a rights-based argument, but we are now talking on a rights-based argument and might actually be able to address one or the other. The argument of the right of the individual and the peoples to bear arms is in direct contrast to the idea that a person has a right not to feel unsafe. And that will probably be considered a straw man argument of whatever is being presented there. But it needs to be addressed on the level of if we're going to argue or debate effectively on a subject, we have to be approaching on the same plane. If we're going to start from a utility, we have to initiate with what is the ideal outcome and is that outcome moral? And so cultural arguments in back and forth over gun control very oftentimes leave the reader or the listener without the satisfaction of catharsis or solution, because you have one group arguing from utility and one group arguing from rights, which reflects many arguments that are made whether you should carry open or concealed in a similar way. And so what would be a solution? Well, in the microcosm of gun culture, it's simply saying, what plane are we arguing on? What plane are we presenting? Are we arguing on the basis of rights? And you probably will find yourself very quickly in a very easy answer. Both the concealed and the open carry person believe in the same set of rights. However, the person who is arguing from concealed is saying, yes, you should be able to carry open, but also be able to carry concealed. And you can see where my bias, if you want to call that, lies. That the ability to carry open and the right to carry open do not sufficiently justify that in the situations where these things are typically brought up, somebody ought carry open. Sometimes it might be better for them to carry concealed. There might be more utility. You're not an easier target. You do not stand out. You do not create an issue for yourself. And then, gray man maxers are going to scream in the comments, but we can let that happen on another day. Go ahead and, tell me your worst open carry stories in the comments. I look forward to hearing them because they have a stereotype for a reason. But this issue about the gun control arguments can be, and this is what I think is important, where I think it's important and demonstrated in our own world. Recently, I've been reading this book called Enough by Mark Kelly and Gabby Giffords, and there's a number of things that are going on in the book, and I'm going to actually have to separate that into an episode on itself because I think it's a book worth responding to. But, well, that's revealing too much anyway. But you have an issue here where the arguments that are being made by the author of the book are not on the same plane as the arguments that are made in support of the right to bear arms. And there is very oftentimes a smack of the utility and then some sort of moralizing in the book where you might say something like, and I can't put words into their mouth, and I don't have it in front of me immediately, but you see this issue presented in how the book makes its argument. In other words, the rhetoric focuses very oftentimes on utility. If bad person A did not have access to firearm, he would have not done bad action A. And then since bad action A would have been done, we would have been justified for the sense of control in the beginning, or we must stop it in the end. And this is where the idea of the dichotomy between open and concealed carry is revealed as a false dichotomy. And if you invert that dichotomy to what we're dealing with in the gun control argument, we'll very oftentimes realize that we have very different outcomes in mind. A trap that is very oftentimes placed in the framing of a conversation on over gun control, gun rights, or human rights, whatever, is the context by which the conversation is framed. And the trap is that one side asserts their worldview without revealing it, and then requires the other to argue for their case in the other person's worldview. And so if I hold a worldview that an individual, a citizen of the United States, has a right to bear arms by dint of them being a human being created in the image of God, and if I believe that, yet I am arguing for the utility of saving lives, I need to go back a step. If I hold a worldview that an individual citizen of the United States has a right to bear arms so long as they have not done something specifically to void that right, like participate in the action of attempted murder or something of that sort, and if I also believe that that right is a restriction on the authorities of government, that if I believe that, then and yet I am expected to argue in another person's worldview that no, a person doesn't have a right, rather that they don't have an inherent human right by nature of being man or human. Rather, those rights are actually civil rights granted by government, and the objective of government is not the protection of individuals' rights being constrained by the Constitution. Rather, it's that the objective of government is to produce utopia, or is to like save lives, I guess, like depending however you want to phrase it. That they have a different worldview, and that differing worldview is asserted in the framing of the question. Then you have an error, a place where the argument will not work. This is one way that I've seen that I think that you can explain away why we have this pattern within American politics where an event will happen, a whole bunch of noise will be made, people will start making all these bad arguments. Those arguments will be responded to and then eventually debunked or deleted or destroyed or crushed, or the persons who are making them are found out to be bad actors, only for a number of years later, another bad event to happen, and the same bad arguments that were already addressed before are now being presented again, very oftentimes by the same people. The trap being that both teams, let's call them teams, the pro-gun, the right to bear arms side versus the pro-gun control side, the trap is that both of them want the same outcome. They both want less deaths. And the answer and the issue with that is not the case. We do not want the same outcome. One person believes that the outcome is less important than the right being presented. Maybe that's a bit of a straw man, and the other is arguing that that rights are less. Well, how am I saying this? It's not that we just all want less people to die, and it's not. And quite frankly, I don't think that's the case. We rather understand that it's not a false dichotomy. You're just arguing from two different frameworks. On the one hand, you have the rights-based argument, and the other, you have the utility. As we see juxtaposed in open versus concealed, they are not the same. So, if this has been helpful, this has been the Redacted Culture Cast. If you've enjoyed this show, leave it in the comments, share it with your friends, and we will see you soon. That being the case, go forth and conquer.